Britain was the world's largest drug cartel. Not a metaphor, not in some grey area of international law. The British government organised opium production in India. British merchants smuggled it into China. And when China tried to stop it, the Royal Navy went to war to keep the drugs flowing. This isn't ancient history. It's why China acts the way it does today. Why Beijing sees the West as fundamentally untrustworthy. And why the next century of global power might be shaped by events from 1840. Here's how the British Empire became a narco-state, how they justified it, and why it matters right now. Before we dive into how Britain became history's most successful narco-state, consider this modern parallel. In the late 20th century, investigative journalists uncovered that the CIA facilitated cocaine trafficking to fund covert operations in Nicaragua. Congressional hearings confirmed that American intelligence agencies at minimum turned a blind eye to drug smuggling by anti-communist rebels. The scandal revealed an uncomfortable truth. When powerful states decide drugs serve their interests, laws bend, morality becomes flexible, and violence protects the flow. The Opium Wars were that dynamic at imperial scale. Britain didn't accidentally enable drug trafficking. It systematically organised, protected, and militarily defended a drug trade that generated millions in revenue and solved its greatest economic problem: how to pay for Chinese tea without hemorrhaging silver. What happened between 1839 and 1842 wasn't just a war. It was the moment a global superpower decided that drug profits justified any level of coercion, and then built the legal and military architecture to sustain it. This matters now because China remembers. Every Chinese schoolchild learns about the Opium Wars as the beginning of the century of humiliation, when foreign powers carved up their country and forced poison on their people. That historical memory shapes Chinese foreign policy today, explains Beijing's hypersensitivity to perceived disrespect from Western nations, and drives China's determination never again to be vulnerable to foreign coercion. When Chinese leaders talk about national rejuvenation, when they build aircraft carriers and assert territorial claims, when they react with fury to Western criticism, they're responding to ghosts from 1840. Understanding the Opium Wars isn't just about understanding history. It's about understanding why the world's rising superpower sees the West the way it does, and why that perception could shape conflicts for decades to come. So how did Britain, a nation that had recently abolished the slave trade on moral grounds, become the world's largest drug pusher? How did opium transform from medicine into economic weapon? And how did the same parliament that debated human rights convince itself that forcing drugs on China was a matter of free trade and national honor? The answers reveal something uncomfortable about power, profit, and the stories nations tell themselves. Let's start with the problem Britain faced. By the late 18th century, Britain was addicted to Chinese tea. Not figuratively addicted, but economically dependent in ways that threatened national finances. The British drank tea at every social level, from aristocratic drawing rooms to factory workers' breakfast tables. Imports grew exponentially. In 1720, Britain imported about £1 million of tea from China. By 1800, that figure had exploded to £23 million annually. Tea wasn't a luxury anymore. It had become essential to British identity and daily life. And China was the only place that produced it in the quantities Britain demanded. Here's where the problem emerged. China wanted almost nothing Britain produced. British wool, clocks, manufactured goods, none of it interested Chinese consumers who had their own sophisticated production systems. Chinese merchants would accept only one thing in payment: silver. So every year, millions of pounds sterling in silver flowed from Britain to China to pay for tea, silk, and porcelain. Britain was running a massive, unsustainable trade deficit. Silver was draining out of the British economy. The East India Company, which held monopoly rights to British trade with China, faced a crisis. Where would they get the silver to keep buying tea? The answer they found was opium, and the system they built to exploit it was breathtakingly sophisticated. It began in India, where the East India Company controlled vast territories in Bengal. Company officials realized that Indian opium could solve their China problem. If they could sell opium to China, they'd earn back the silver they spent on tea. It was perfect circular logic. Use Indian opium to generate silver in China. Use that silver to buy Chinese tea. Sell the tea in Britain for profit. One problem: China had banned opium imports since 1729, recognizing its destructive effects. The Qing government issued repeated edicts prohibiting the trade, threatening severe penalties for traffickers. The East India Company's response was to build a drug empire with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the coercion of a mafia. In Bengal and Malwa, company officials pressured or forced peasant farmers to cultivate opium poppies instead of food crops. The company established a monopoly control system. Peasants were required to sell their opium harvest to company agents at fixed, often unfairly low prices. The company processed the raw opium in factories it controlled, transforming it into standardized cakes of refined product. Then came the genius, or the evil, of the system. The company sold this processed opium at public auctions in Calcutta. Who bought it at these auctions? Private British merchants, the traders who would become known as the opium taipans. Men like William Jardine and James Matheson built fortunes and trading empires on these purchases. They were the public face of the smuggling operation. They bought opium legally at Calcutta auctions, loaded it onto fast clipper ships, and transported it to the coast of China, where the real business began. Because opium was illegal in China, these merchants couldn't simply sail into Chinese ports and unload. Instead, they anchored large ships, floating warehouses, off the coast near Canton and Macau. Smaller boats, launchers and smuggling junks, operated by Chinese intermediaries, would come out to these floating warehouses, purchase opium, and smuggle it inland through elaborate coastal networks. This wasn't small-scale trafficking. By the 1830s, the system was moving industrial quantities of drugs. In the season of 1835 to 1836, about 35,000 chests of opium entered China. Each chest contained roughly 60 kilograms of opium. That's over 2 million kilograms of refined narcotics in a single year. By 1838, the figure had climbed to 40,000 chests annually. To put that in perspective, that's 2.4 million kilograms of opium. The entire operation generated profits that dwarfed most other commodities. A chest of opium cost about £2 to produce in India. It sold for £10 to £15 in China. The markup was astronomical, and everyone in the chain took a cut. Indian peasants got poverty wages. Company officials took auction fees and processing profits. Private merchants made fortunes on the smuggling, and the East India Company's government in India earned massive revenue. By 1838, opium sales provided nearly 15% of the total revenue of British India. The colonial administration was literally funded by drug money. The human cost in India rarely entered British calculations, but it was devastating. Peasants forced to grow opium instead of food faced periodic famines. Those who resisted company pressure found themselves in debt to moneylenders connected to company officials. The opium system was a form of economic coercion that destroyed local food security and trapped farmers in cycles of dependency. One British official in India privately admitted the system amounted to forced cultivation, but the profits were too enormous to stop. On the Chinese side, the effects were catastrophic and increasingly visible by the 1830s. Opium smoking had spread from coastal traders and elites into broader society. Soldiers, officials, merchants, and laborers were smoking opium in quantities that alarmed the Qing government. The drug's effects were obvious: addiction, physical deterioration, loss of productivity, social breakdown. Families were ruined by addicted members. Government treasuries were drained as silver flowed out to pay for opium, reversing the old trade balance. Now silver was hemorrhaging from China to pay for British drugs. One estimate suggests that by 1838, China was losing 6 million taels of silver annually to the opium trade. This wasn't just a social problem. It was an economic crisis that threatened the Qing state's fiscal foundation. Chinese officials memorialized the emperor with increasingly desperate warnings. Provincial governors reported addictions spreading among banner troops, the Qing military forces. Government clerks and bureaucrats were found smoking opium on duty. Silver scarcity was driving up prices and causing deflation that hurt farmers and workers. The memorials painted a picture of a society being poisoned, an economy being drained, and a government losing control. And behind it all was a foreign power, Britain, whose merchants and government agents systematically violated Chinese law, bribed Chinese officials, and profited from China's misery. Here's where the moral contradiction becomes stark. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire, driven by evangelical Christians and moral reformers who argued that human dignity could not be bought and sold. Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act in a wave of humanitarian sentiment. British society congratulated itself on moral progress, yet at the exact same moment, the same government was facilitating and protecting a trade that enslaved millions of Chinese to opium addiction. When critics pointed out this hypocrisy, defenders of the opium trade had ready answers. They claimed opium smoking was a matter of personal choice. They argued that if Chinese people wanted to smoke opium, that was China's internal problem, not Britain's responsibility. They insisted that Britain was simply engaged in free trade, and that China had no right to restrict commerce. These arguments sound absurd today, but they were effective then because they tapped into powerful ideological currents. The 1830s and 1840s were the age of free trade ideology in Britain. Economists and politicians argued that unrestricted commerce benefited everyone, that barriers to trade were artificial constraints on natural human exchange, and that governments should not interfere in markets. This ideology served British interests perfectly. Britain was the world's manufacturing powerhouse. Free trade meant British goods could flow everywhere, breaking down protective barriers other countries erected. Applying free trade logic to opium was a rhetorical masterstroke. It transformed a drug smuggling operation into a principled stand for economic liberty. When China tried to ban opium, British officials framed it not as drug enforcement, but as protectionism, as China unfairly discriminating against British commerce. The genius of this framing was that it flipped the moral equation. Instead of Britain being the aggressor pushing drugs, China became the villain restricting trade. Instead of British merchants being criminals violating Chinese law, they became victims of Chinese tyranny. Instead of the Qing government defending its people from addiction, it was painted as a backwards despotism, refusing to join the modern world of commerce. This rhetorical inversion allowed British elites to defend the indefensible, to protect drug profits while claiming the moral high ground of free trade and progress. But not everyone in Britain bought it. Even at the time, critics saw through the smokescreen. Members of Parliament, missionaries and moral reformers condemned the opium trade. William Gladstone, who would become Prime Minister, called the First Opium War more unjust in its origin than any war in British history. He declared that the British flag had never flown to protect a more infamous contraband traffic. Religious societies, Baptists, Wesleyans, Methodists, petitioned Parliament to stop the trade, arguing that Christians could not profit from destroying Chinese lives. These critics faced fierce opposition from merchants and officials who had financial stakes in the trade, but they kept the moral argument alive in British public debate. What made the system so insidious was its distributed responsibility. No single person or institution could be blamed for everything. The East India Company said it only produced and auctioned opium. It didn't force anyone to buy it. Private merchants said they were just responding to market demand. They didn't create Chinese addiction. The British government said it couldn't control private merchants engaged in legal commerce in India. Chinese smugglers and corrupt officials said they were just trying to survive in a system where refusal meant poverty. Everyone passed blame along the chain. Yet the system as a whole functioned with ruthless efficiency to move drugs from Indian fields to Chinese lungs, generating profits at every step and destroying lives at the end. By 1838, the Qing court faced a decision it could no longer postpone. The opium crisis was reaching critical levels. The Daoguang emperor, who had ruled since 1820, received memorials from his officials debating what to do. Some officials proposed legalizing opium and taxing it, arguing that prohibition had failed and that the government might as well profit from the inevitable trade. Other officials vehemently opposed legalization, arguing that it would morally sanction poison and worsen the crisis. After months of debate, the emperor made his choice. He rejected legalization. Instead, he appointed a hardline official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to suppress the opium trade at Canton, the southern port city where foreign merchants operated. Lin Zexu was not a typical bureaucrat. He was a scholar official known for integrity, administrative skill, and Confucian moral rigidity. He saw opium as a poison that violated every principle of good government. Government existed to protect and improve the lives of its people. Opium destroyed lives. Therefore, the government had a moral duty to eliminate it. For Lin, this was not complicated. He arrived in Canton in March 1839 with clear instructions: stop the opium trade by any means necessary. He immediately began implementing a comprehensive campaign. He arrested Chinese opium dealers and forced addicts into treatment programs. He ordered opium dens closed. He demanded that Chinese merchants and foreign traders sign bonds promising never to import opium again, with the penalty of death for violations. The foreign merchants, particularly the British, refused to sign the bonds. They claimed they couldn't be held to Chinese law. They insisted that as British subjects, they could only be tried by British authorities. This wasn't just arrogance. Britain had spent decades asserting extraterritoriality, the principle that its citizens abroad were not subject to local jurisdiction. British officials in China had repeatedly refused to turn over British citizens accused of crimes to Chinese courts. The logic was paternalistic and racist. Chinese law was seen as barbaric, Chinese justice as arbitrary, and British subjects as too civilized to be subjected to it. When Lin demanded the bonds, he ran headlong into this refusal to accept Chinese sovereignty over foreign residents. Lin responded by escalating. On March 24, 1839, he surrounded the foreign factories at Canton, the compound where European and American merchants lived and worked. He posted soldiers at the gates. No one could leave, no goods could move. He cut off food supplies. It was a blockade, and Lin made his demands clear. The foreign merchants must surrender all opium in their possession, every chest, every ounce. Until they did, the blockade would continue. For 6 weeks, the merchants were trapped. Charles Elliot, the British Chief Superintendent of Trade, the official representative of the British government in Canton, tried to negotiate. He realized Lin was serious, that this was not the usual Chinese protest that could be bribed or delayed. Lin had imperial backing and clear orders. Elliot made a fateful decision. He told the British merchants to surrender their opium, and he promised that the British government would compensate them for their losses. This promise was critical. It transformed a private commercial dispute into a state obligation. If the merchants were surrendering their property and the government promised compensation, then the British state was assuming responsibility for the opium. When China destroyed that opium, it would be destroying British government property, not just private merchant contraband. Elliot may not have fully intended this outcome, but that's what happened. The merchants, reassured by Elliot's promise, surrendered approximately 20,000 chests of opium. That's over 1 million kilograms of refined opium worth millions of pounds sterling. It was the largest drug seizure in history to that point. Lin ordered the opium taken to Human, a beach area near Canton. There, in full public view, he organized the destruction of the drugs. Workers dug large trenches, filled them with the opium mixed with salt and lime to neutralize it, then flushed the mixture into the sea. The process took 23 days, from June 3 to June 25, 1839. It was theatre as much as enforcement. Lin wanted Chinese people to see that their government was serious. He wanted foreign merchants to see that Chinese law would be enforced. He wanted the world to know that China would not tolerate being poisoned for foreign profit. The human destruction became legendary in China, a moment when a Chinese official stood up to Western power and defended Chinese sovereignty. But Lin didn't stop with destruction. He also tried diplomacy. He wrote a remarkable letter addressed to Queen Victoria, Britain's monarch. The letter is worth quoting at length because it reveals how Lin understood the moral stakes. He asked, in essence, how Britain could export to China what Britain itself prohibited. "I have heard that smoking opium is strictly forbidden in your country," Lin wrote, "because its harm is clearly understood. Since you do not permit it to injure your own country, you ought not to have this injurious drug transferred to another country." The logic was unassailable. If opium is harmful enough that Britain bans it at home, by what moral right does Britain export it abroad? Lin appealed to universal principles of human decency. What is here forbidden to consume, your dependencies must be forbidden to manufacture, and what is here forbidden to manufacture, your dependencies must be forbidden to sell. He ended with a warning. If the opium trade did not stop, China would take increasingly severe measures. The letter probably never reached Queen Victoria. It was sent through British officials who had no interest in delivering it. But the letter's publication in China served Lin's purpose, demonstrating to the Chinese people and the Qing court that their government had tried moral persuasion before resorting to force. From the British perspective, Lin's actions were outrageous. The merchants and officials in Canton were furious. They had surrendered opium under duress, effectively coerced by a blockade. The opium had been destroyed without compensation. And now China was demanding that foreign merchants sign bonds accepting Chinese jurisdiction and capital punishment for future violations. British merchants began leaving Canton, relocating to Macau and Hong Kong, small harbours where Chinese control was weak. They wrote letters to London demanding action. The most influential merchants, particularly William Jardine, returned to Britain and lobbied officials directly. Jardine met with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston and other cabinet members, providing detailed intelligence on Chinese defences and urging military intervention. Jardine and others argued that Britain had to respond forcefully or lose all credibility and commercial access in China. They framed Lin's actions as an attack on British property and British lives. They claimed that the blockade was equivalent to kidnapping British subjects. They insisted that China had violated the law of nations, the emerging body of international law that governed relations between states. In their telling, Britain was the aggrieved party, defending its legal rights against Chinese aggression. The fact that those legal rights included the right to smuggle drugs into China was carefully downplayed. Instead, the focus shifted to property rights, diplomatic protocol, and national honour. In London, the government debated how to respond. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, was initially sceptical of military action. Britain was engaged in other imperial conflicts, and a war with China seemed costly and potentially unwinnable given the distances involved. But the merchant lobby was powerful and persistent. They provided maps, intelligence on Chinese fortifications, and estimates of how many ships and troops would be needed. They argued that a short, sharp naval campaign could force China to negotiate and open trade on British terms. They dangled the prospect of vast Chinese markets opening to British manufactured goods, textiles and machinery that would employ British workers and enrich British investors. And they pointed out that if Britain didn't act, other foreign powers, particularly the United States, would step into the Chinese market and Britain would lose its advantage. Palmerston was also influenced by broader imperial logic. The British Empire in the 1830s was at a peak of confidence. Britain had defeated Napoleon, industrialized ahead of rivals, and expanded its colonial holdings across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. British officials believed in their civilization's superiority and their right to open closed societies to commerce and Christianity. China, in this worldview, was a backwards despotism that needed to be brought into the modern world of nation-states and free trade. If China refused to join that world voluntarily, Britain had the right and duty to compel it. This paternalistic imperialism made war easier to justify. It wasn't aggression, it was enlightenment enforced by gunboats. Parliament debated the China question in heated sessions in early 1840. The debates reveal the divided conscience of Britain. Some members, like Gladstone, condemned the war in moral terms. Gladstone declared that a war to protect the opium trade would cover Britain in permanent disgrace. He asked how Britain could possibly justify using its armed forces to compel another nation to accept imports of poison. Other MPs, representing merchant and manufacturing interests, argued that China's restrictions violated free trade principles and that British property and lives had to be protected. The vote was close. The House of Commons approved military action by a narrow margin of 9 votes. It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was enough. In June 1840, a British expeditionary force arrived off the coast of China. It consisted of 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 27 transport ships, and approximately 4,000 troops, a mix of British soldiers and Indian sepoys from the company's armies. The commander, Rear Admiral George Eliot, had orders to blockade Canton and the Yangtze River, capture coastal islands to use as bases, and force the Qing government to negotiate. The British strategy relied on naval superiority. British warships, particularly the steamers, represented military technology that China could not match. Chinese defences relied on shore batteries with outdated cannons and fleets of war junks, large wooden sailing ships that were no match for British steam and firepower. The technological gap was enormous and shaped every battle. Consider the steamer Nemesis, one of the first iron-hulled steam warships deployed in combat. Nemesis could move independently of wind and tide, navigate shallow rivers, and carry heavy guns that could bombard shore positions from beyond the range of Chinese return fire. In battle after battle, Nemesis demonstrated devastating effectiveness. It destroyed Chinese war junks by the dozens, each salvo of rockets and cannon fire splintering wooden hulls and killing crews. Chinese commanders had no counter to steam power. Their ships couldn't maneuver quickly enough. Their cannons couldn't reach the British vessels. Their troops couldn't match British rifles and artillery. The disparity was so great that British casualties in most engagements were minimal, while Chinese forces suffered catastrophic losses. The first major action came in July 1840 when British forces captured Dinghai, a port city on Zhoushan Island near the mouth of the Yangtze River. The British bombardment lasted only a few hours. Chinese shore batteries returned fire but couldn't match the range or accuracy of British naval guns. British troops landed and took the city with minimal resistance. The local Chinese commander, facing overwhelming force, committed suicide in despair, a traditional act of loyalty and shame. The capture of Dingai gave Britain a forward base and sent a message to Beijing. British forces could strike anywhere along China's coast. The Qing government, shocked by the speed and ease of the British victory, sent negotiators to talk. But negotiations went nowhere. The Qing court offered minor concessions, trade adjustments and small indemnities, but refused the core British demands: compensation for the destroyed opium, opening multiple ports to trade, and the cession of territory. British officials, empowered by their military success, refused to settle for less. The war resumed. Over the next 2 years, British forces conducted a campaign of sequential coastal assaults, moving north and then back south along China's coast and rivers. Each battle followed a similar pattern. British ships would approach a fortified city, bombard it from sea, land troops to storm defences, and overwhelm Chinese resistance through superior firepower and discipline. January 1841 brought the Battle of Chuenpi. Chinese forces had constructed elaborate river defences at Chuenpi and Taikokhtao, forts guarding the approach to Cantonup, the Pearl River. On January 7th, British forces attacked. Steamers and sailing ships manoeuvred close to the forts, fired broadsides into the Chinese positions, and then landed troops to assault the forts from the rear. The Chinese defenders fought bravely, but were outmatched. Within hours, both forts had fallen. The British captured over 200 Chinese cannons and spiked them, rendering them useless. Chinese casualties were in the hundreds. British casualties were fewer than a dozen killed and wounded. The lopsided outcome repeated itself at battle after battle. After Chuenpi, British forces advanced toward Canton itself. Facing the prospect of the city being shelled and stormed, Canton's officials negotiated a local truce. They agreed to pay a large indemnity and evacuate Chinese troops from the city's environs. In return, British forces halted their advance and withdrew to offshore islands. But this truce was temporary and unsatisfying to both sides. In London, officials were angry that Charles Elliot had accepted such limited terms. Palmerston sent new instructions and a new plenipotentiary, Sir Henry Pottinger, with orders to demand much more. The war would continue until China accepted a comprehensive treaty. In August 1841, British forces resumed offensive operations, this time targeting cities along the southeastern coast. On August 26th, they attacked Amoy, modern-day Xiamen. The battle was over in an afternoon. British ships bombarded Amoy's forts, troops landed and stormed the defences, and Chinese forces retreated inland. By nightfall, the British controlled the city. 2 months later, in October, British forces captured Ningbo, another coastal city south of Shanghai. Again, overwhelming firepower and steam mobility gave Britain easy victories. Chinese commanders tried different tactics. They attempted night attacks to negate British firepower advantages. They dug entrenchments and tried to force British troops into costly assaults. But nothing worked. British rifles outranged Chinese matchlocks. British artillery could destroy defences before infantry advanced. And British logistics, supplied by sea, allowed sustained operations that exhausted Chinese defenders. One of the most dramatic battles came in May 1842 at Jiapu, also called Chapu, a fortified town near Hangzhou Bay. Jiapu's garrison was composed of elite Manchu bannermen, troops considered the best the Qing could field. The British attacked on May 18th with artillery barrages and rocket fire. Congreve rockets, a relatively new weapon, streaked into Chinese positions, causing fires and chaos. Then British infantry, including Irish and Scottish regiments, along with Indian sepoy units, stormed the breaches. The fighting at Jiapu was brutal and close quarters. Chinese defenders fought with desperation, firing cannons loaded with grapeshot and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. But British discipline and firepower prevailed. After hours of fighting, Jiapu fell. British casualties were light, 9 killed and 55 wounded. Chinese casualties were estimated in the hundreds, with the Manchu garrison fighting almost to the last man rather than surrender. The psychological impact of these battles on the Qing government and military cannot be overstated. Chinese commanders reported back to Beijing in despairing terms. One memorial described British steamships as moving against the wind and tide like dragons, and British soldiers as firing in coordinated volleys that fell like rain. Another official wrote that Chinese cannons could not reach the British ships, and when Chinese war junks approached, the British steamers simply manoeuvred out of reach and destroyed them at leisure. The memorials painted a picture of a military confronted with technology and tactics it could not counter. Qing China had not fought a modern industrialized military before. The shock was profound. By the summer of 1842, British forces controlled key points along China's coast and were advancing up the Yangtze River toward Nanjing, one of China's most important cities. On June 19th, British forces captured Shanghai without significant resistance. The city's officials, hearing of British victories elsewhere, chose not to defend. Then, on July 21st, came the battle for Zhenjiang, also called Qingqiang, a critical city at the junction of the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal. Zhenjiang was heavily defended with Manchu banner troops. The battle was fierce. British forces bombarded the city walls, then stormed them in coordinated assaults. Chinese defenders fought street by street, house by house. The Tatar general, the Manchu commander of the garrison, refused to surrender and died when British troops set fire to his headquarters. The fall of Zhenjiang opened the way to Nanjing. With British gunboats on the Yangtze approaching Nanjing and threatening to bombard the city, the Qing court capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Qing negotiators signed the Treaty of Nanking aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored in the Yangtze outside Nanjing. The treaty's terms were dictated by Britain. China would pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a staggering sum. 6 million was specifically designated as compensation for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. 12 million covered British war costs. 3 million compensated merchants for other debts. China would cede Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, would be open to British trade and residence. British citizens in these ports would be subject to British law, not Chinese, establishing extraterritoriality. Tariffs on trade would be fixed at low rates, meaning China could not protect its industries or control imports. And all these terms applied equally to any other foreign power through most favoured nation clauses. The Treaty of Nanking was, from the Chinese perspective, a humiliation forced at gunpoint. The Qing negotiators had no leverage. British forces occupied key cities and could march on Beijing if the court refused. The treaty violated Chinese sovereignty in fundamental ways, ceding territory, allowing foreigners to live under their own laws, surrendering control over tariffs. All of this subordinated China to foreign dictation. The Qing court saw the treaty as a temporary concession made under duress, something to accept now and overturn later. Chinese officials assumed that once British forces left, China could reassert control. They were wrong. The Treaty of Nanking became the first of many unequal treaties that progressively weakened Qing sovereignty over the next 70 years. From the British perspective, the treaty was a triumph of gunboat diplomacy. Britain had forced one of the world's largest empires to accept its terms through a short, relatively inexpensive military campaign. British casualties during the entire war were fewer than 500 killed in action, with disease taking a larger toll. The financial cost of the war was more than recouped by the indemnity China paid. And most importantly for British commerce, the treaty opened China to trade on terms that favoured Britain. British merchants could now legally reside in 5 major ports. Opium, while not explicitly legalised in the Treaty of Nanking, flowed freely through these treaty ports because the low fixed tariffs made smuggling unnecessary, and Chinese officials lacked the power to stop it. Here's the critical point about the treaty and opium. The Treaty of Nanking didn't mention opium directly. Officially, opium remained illegal under Chinese law, but the treaty's practical effect was to legalise the opium trade by making it impossible to enforce the ban. With British merchants operating freely in 5 ports, with extraterritoriality protecting them from Chinese prosecution, and with British naval power backing their activities, the opium trade not only continued but expanded. Within a few years of the treaty, opium imports to China more than doubled. By the 1850s, China was importing over 60,000 chests annually, drowning the country in narcotics and silver drainage. So Britain fought a war, killed thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians, forced massive indemnities, seized territory, and opened China to trade, all to protect and expand an illegal drug trade. That's not an exaggeration or moral judgment imposed from our modern perspective. That's what happened based on the documentary record. The British government knew it was protecting opium smugglers. Parliamentary debates openly discussed the opium trade as the casus belli. British merchants explicitly demanded compensation for destroyed opium and military action to secure future trade. And British military forces were deployed with the specific objective of forcing China to accept terms that would allow opium to flow freely. How did British officials and opinion makers justify this? How did a nation that prided itself on civilization and Christianity defend forcing drugs on another country? The arguments deployed in Parliament and the press reveal sophisticated techniques of moral evasion that deserve examination because they're still used today to justify state violence in pursuit of economic interests. The primary justification was free trade doctrine. British officials and merchants argued that China had no right to restrict commerce. They framed Lin Zexu's seizure of opium not as drug enforcement but as an arbitrary confiscation of private property. In this telling, the issue wasn't the nature of the commodity, opium, but the principle of property rights and free exchange. If Chinese people wanted to buy opium and British merchants wanted to sell it, what right did the Chinese government have to interfere? This was government tyranny restricting natural liberty. Britain, as the champion of free trade, had a duty to oppose such restrictions. This argument sounds absurd when we remember we're talking about addictive narcotics, but it was persuasive in 1840s Britain because free trade ideology had become almost a religion. Economists like David Ricardo and political movements like the Anti-Corn Law League had convinced many Britons that free trade was not just economically beneficial, but morally righteous. Tariffs and trade barriers were seen as government interference that hurt consumers and enriched special interests. Removing barriers to trade was therefore a moral cause, spreading prosperity and peace. Applying this logic to opium required ignoring the specific harms of addiction, but that's exactly what free trade advocates did. They treated opium as just another commodity like cotton or tea and applied the same principles. The second major justification was extraterritoriality and diplomatic equality. British officials argued that China's legal system was barbaric and that British subjects could not be subjected to it. When Lin Zexu demanded that foreign merchants sign bonds accepting Chinese law and potential death penalties for opium smuggling, British officials refused on principle. They claimed that Britain, as a sovereign nation, had the right to protect its citizens abroad and ensure they were tried under British law. This became a cause célèbre. British newspapers ran stories about Chinese torture and arbitrary executions, painting the Qing legal system as savage and unjust. The refusal to let British citizens be tried in Chinese courts was framed as defending civilization against barbarism. Of course, this argument was deeply hypocritical. Britain routinely subjected foreign visitors to British law. If a Chinese merchant violated British law in London, they would be tried in British courts under British penalties. But when the roles reversed, Britain claimed exemption. The real logic was racial and imperial. British officials simply didn't believe Chinese law and Chinese sovereignty deserved the same respect as European systems. This paternalistic racism allowed British officials to present their refusal to submit to Chinese authority as a matter of principle rather than what it was, a claim of superiority that placed British interests above Chinese sovereignty. The third justification was more nakedly strategic. Some officials argued that controlling trade with China was essential to British imperial interests, and that rival powers, particularly France and the United States, would seize opportunities Britain missed. If Britain didn't force China open, other nations would, and Britain would lose commercial advantage. This argument appealed to competitive imperialism. It suggested that the morality of the opium trade was irrelevant because international politics was a struggle for power and markets. Nations that hesitated on moral grounds would be overtaken by less scrupulous rivals. Britain had to act ruthlessly or decline. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary who prosecuted the war, exemplified this cold realpolitik. When critics in Parliament accused him of waging an immoral war for drug profits, Palmerston responded with contempt. He argued that Britain's role was not to enforce Chinese morality but to protect British interests. He famously said he would never vote funds to send the Royal Navy to protect Chinese morals from opium when Britain didn't enforce Chinese laws at home. The sarcasm was pointed. If morality meant respecting every nation's internal laws, Britain would have to enforce countless foreign prohibitions, an absurd proposition. Instead, Palmerston insisted Britain should pursue its interests and let China worry about its own social problems. This argument reveals an underlying philosophy that transcended the opium trade. Palmerston and officials like him believed that powerful nations had the right to impose their will on weaker ones, that international law and morality were secondary to national interest, and that the expansion of British commerce was itself a civilizing force that justified coercion. This worldview permitted extraordinary mental gymnastics. British officials could simultaneously present themselves as defenders of liberty and progress while using military force to compel another nation to accept a product that nation desperately wanted to ban. The fourth justification, deployed particularly by merchant interests, was to shift blame onto Chinese consumers. Merchants argued that opium smoking was a personal choice made by Chinese individuals. If Chinese people wanted to smoke opium, that was their business. Britain wasn't forcing anyone to smoke. Britain was simply providing a product that Chinese consumers demanded. If China's government couldn't control its own population's habits, that was China's failure, not Britain's responsibility. This argument treated addiction as a personal moral failing rather than a public health crisis, and it ignored the active marketing and bribery that British merchants used to expand the opium trade. This blame-shifting rhetoric should sound familiar. It's the same argument tobacco companies made in the late 20th century. We don't force anyone to smoke. Consumers make free choices. Health problems are individual responsibility. It's the same argument gun manufacturers make. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. The logic deflects attention from the entity profiting from harm to the individuals experiencing harm. It's effective because it contains a grain of truth. Chinese opium smokers did make choices, but those choices were made in contexts shaped by British commercial strategy, aggressive marketing by merchants who bribed officials and normalized smoking, and the overwhelming supply of cheap opium that British imperial logistics made possible. Not everyone in Britain accepted these justifications. Opposition to the war and the opium trade came from several sources. Evangelical Christians and missionary societies were horrified. Organizations like the London Missionary Society, Baptist Missionary Society, and Wesleyan Methodists petitioned Parliament to stop the opium trade. They argued that Christians could not profit from destroying human lives. Missionaries working in China reported back on the devastating effects of opium addiction and pleaded with British authorities to end the trade. These religious groups faced an uphill battle because they lacked the economic power and political connections of merchant interests, but they kept the moral argument alive in British public discourse. Some members of Parliament opposed the war on both moral and strategic grounds. William Gladstone, as mentioned, gave passionate speeches condemning the war as a stain on British honour. He argued that history would judge Britain harshly for using violence to protect drug smuggling. Richard Cobden, a leader of the free trade movement, opposed the war because he believed true free trade should be voluntary, not imposed by force. Cobden argued that gunboat diplomacy contradicted genuine free exchange and that Britain was damaging its long-term commercial interests by alienating China. Sir Robert Peel, then Prime Minister, privately expressed discomfort with the war, but felt politically bound to support it once British forces were engaged. The parliamentary vote authorising military action in April 1840 passed by only 9 votes, 271 to 262. It was remarkably close given Britain's overwhelming military advantage and the economic interests at stake. The narrow margin suggests deep ambivalence in British society. Many MPs voted for war not because they supported opium trafficking, but because they felt Britain's prestige was on the line once British merchants had been blockaded and British property seized. Once the issue was framed as national honour rather than opium, it became harder to vote against action. This is a classic mechanism of escalation. Initial provocations, Lynn's blockade and seizure, create imperatives to respond that override the underlying moral questions about what Britain was doing in China in the first place. After the war, moral opposition intensified. As opium imports to China soared in the 1840s and 1850s, reports of addiction and social breakdown multiplied. British missionaries in China sent detailed accounts of opium's devastation to churches and newspapers in Britain. They described families destroyed, children neglected, workers incapacitated, all consequences of the addiction Britain had facilitated. These reports gradually shifted British public opinion. By the 1860s and 1870s, there was significant support in Britain for ending the opium trade. Anti-opium societies formed, lobbying Parliament to halt exports. Yet the trade continued for decades because the economic interests were so powerful and because British India's finances depended on opium revenue. The British government's ultimate response to moral criticism was to slowly, grudgingly reduce official involvement in the opium trade while allowing it to continue through private channels. In the early 20th century, international pressure and changing norms finally led to restrictions on opium exports. But this came only after nearly a century of British-facilitated opium addiction in China, after millions of lives destroyed, and after the damage to China's economy and society had become irreversible. Let's step back and assess what the term drug cartel means and whether it applies to Britain's role in the opium trade. A drug cartel is typically defined as an organization that controls the production, distribution, and sale of illegal drugs, often using violence and corruption to protect its operations and maximize profits. Cartels operate outside the law and use state weakness or complicity to sustain their business. How does Britain's opium trade fit this definition? First, control of production. The East India Company exercised monopoly control over opium production in Bengal and licensed production in Malwa. It coerced peasants to grow poppies, processed raw opium in company factories, and regulated quality and supply. This was centralized production control at an industrial scale, exactly what cartels do. Second, distribution networks. British merchants established sophisticated smuggling networks using fast ships, coastal intermediaries, and corrupt Chinese officials. They operated outside Chinese law, using bribery and violence when necessary to protect their supply chains. Third, profit maximization. The opium trade generated enormous profits for the company, private merchants, and the British Indian government. These profits were the driving motive for continuing the trade despite known harms. Fourth, use of violence. When China tried to enforce its laws and stop the trade, Britain responded with military force. The First Opium War was fundamentally a military operation to protect and expand a drug trade. This is where the cartel analogy becomes most powerful. Cartels use violence to eliminate law enforcement threats and maintain their operations. Britain did exactly that, using the Royal Navy and British Army to eliminate Chinese enforcement efforts and ensure opium continued to flow. The scale was vastly larger than any criminal cartel, but the logic was identical. Violence in defense of drug profits. Fifth, state complicity. Criminal cartels typically operate in contexts of state weakness or corruption, where government officials are bribed to look the other way or actively assist trafficking. Britain's situation was different and more disturbing. The British state wasn't complicit in the opium trade. The British state was the opium trade. The East India Company was a state-chartered entity governing British India. The Royal Navy was Britain's military force. The treaty that legalised opium imports to China was signed by British government representatives acting on orders from London. There was no separation between the drug trade and state power. They were fused. So is calling Britain a drug cartel accurate or anachronistic? The term is anachronistic in the sense that drug cartel as a phrase didn't exist in the 1840s, and British officials certainly didn't see themselves as criminals. But the term is accurate in describing the functional reality of what Britain was doing, using state power to control drug production, protect drug smuggling, and employ violence to ensure drug markets remained open. If we define a cartel by its actions rather than its self-perception, Britain's behaviour fits the definition precisely. The difference is that Britain was a legitimate government with recognised sovereignty, which made its drug operations legal under British law, even as they violated Chinese law. This is what makes the case so disturbing. It wasn't criminals acting outside the law. It was a government deciding that drug profits justified overriding another nation's sovereignty and laws. Modern parallels illuminate why this history matters. In the 1980s, investigative journalists uncovered evidence that the CIA had facilitated cocaine trafficking by Nicaraguan Contra rebels. The agency's priority was funding anti-communist insurgents. When those insurgents financed themselves through cocaine sales, the CIA looked the other way and in some cases actively assisted trafficking to protect the larger strategic goal. Congressional hearings confirmed that drug enforcement took a back seat to Cold War imperatives. The scandal revealed that when states prioritize other goals, geopolitical or economic, they become complicit in drug trafficking. The parallel to British opium policy is striking. Britain prioritized trade balance and imperial expansion over Chinese welfare and law enforcement. When those priorities conflicted with stopping drug addiction, Britain chose commerce and power. The CIA chose Cold War strategy over drug enforcement. In both cases, state power facilitated drug trafficking because other interests were deemed more important. The mechanisms differ, but the underlying logic is the same. States are not inherently moral actors. They pursue interests, and when those interests align with drug trafficking, laws and morality become obstacles to bypass rather than principles to uphold. Another modern parallel is the global pharmaceutical industry's role in the opioid epidemic. Companies like Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed prescription opioids, downplaying addiction risks and encouraging overprescription. They used sophisticated marketing, financial incentives to doctors, and lobbying to protect their market. When addiction became epidemic and overdoses soared, these companies shifted blame to doctors and patients. They argued they were providing medicine, that prescribing decisions were doctors' responsibility, and that patients who became addicted had made personal choices. The rhetoric closely mirrors British merchants' arguments about Chinese opium smokers. Individual choice, personal responsibility, corporate innocence. The comparison isn't perfect. Prescription opioids were legal, marketed as medicine, and many patients legitimately needed pain relief. But the pattern of corporate profit-driving supply, aggressive marketing normalizing use, addictions spiraling out of control, and blame deflected onto consumers echoes the dynamics of the opium trade. In both cases, entities with power and resources shaped the conditions in which individuals made choices, then profited from those choices while disclaiming responsibility for resulting harms. What makes the British opium trade uniquely egregious is the combination of state power, military violence, and moral hypocrisy. Pharmaceutical companies are rapacious, but they didn't send armies to force governments to allow opioid sales. The CIA's complicity in cocaine trafficking was covert and denied, not openly defended as national policy. Britain did all of this openly, defended it in Parliament, inscribed it in treaties, and celebrated it as imperial success. The brazenness is breathtaking. Now let's turn to the long-term consequences, because the First Opium War didn't end with the Treaty of Nanking. It began a process that transformed China and shaped the world we live in today. The treaty opened China to foreign domination, undermined the Qing dynasty's legitimacy, and created the conditions for a century of internal collapse and external predation. Understanding these consequences is essential to understanding modern China. The most immediate consequence was that the opium trade exploded. With British merchants operating freely in treaty ports and British naval power deterring Chinese enforcement, opium imports skyrocketed. In the decade after the treaty, imports doubled from about 40,000 chests to over 80,000 chests annually. By the 1870s, China was importing over 90,000 chests per year. Millions of Chinese were addicted. The social and economic damage was catastrophic. Families were destroyed. Productivity collapsed in some regions. Silver continued to drain from China, worsening deflation and economic instability. The Qing government, humiliated and weakened by the treaty, faced growing internal challenges. The massive indemnity payments required raising taxes, which fueled popular resentment. The government's inability to stop foreign dictation undermined its legitimacy in the eyes of both elites and common people. If the emperor could not protect China from foreign predation, what was the mandate of heaven worth? This legitimacy crisis contributed directly to the outbreak of the Taiping Rebellion in 1850, the deadliest conflict of the 19th century. The Taiping Rebellion was a massive civil war led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service exam candidate who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ. He attracted millions of followers, many of them poor peasants suffering from economic dislocation, opium addiction, and Qing government oppression. The rebellion sought to overthrow the Qing and establish a theocratic state. It raged from 1850 to 1864, killing an estimated 20 to 30 million people. While the rebellion's causes were complex and primarily internal, the Qing government's weakness after the Opium War contributed to the instability that allowed the rebellion to spread. And during the rebellion, foreign powers, including Britain, intervened to support the Qing, not out of altruism, but because they feared a Taiping victory would disrupt the trade and treaty arrangements they had forced on China. Meanwhile, foreign powers pressed for additional concessions. The Treaty of Nanking was followed by more unequal treaties. In 1844, the United States signed the Treaty of Wanghia, gaining the same privileges Britain had extracted. France signed the Treaty of Whampoa, also in 1844, gaining similar terms. These treaties included most favored nation clauses, meaning any concession China granted to one foreign power automatically applied to all. China was trapped in a ratchet of escalating foreign privileges. Then came the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, sometimes called the Arrow War. The pretext was minor incidents involving British and French nationals, but the underlying cause was British and French desire for more concessions, particularly explicit legalization of opium and opening more of China's interior to foreign trade. The Second Opium War was even more one-sided than the first. Anglo-French forces defeated Qing armies, marched on Beijing, and in a notorious act of vandalism, burned the old Summer Palace, the Emperor's magnificent garden palace outside Beijing, in retaliation for Chinese capture and mistreatment of prisoners. The palace's destruction became another symbol of national humiliation for China. The resulting treaties, the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860, forced even more concessions. Opium was explicitly legalized under a tariff system. China had to pay more indemnities. More ports were opened. Foreign powers gained the right to station diplomats in Beijing and to navigate the Yangtze River into China's interior. Christian missionaries were allowed to operate freely and own property anywhere in China. Extraterritoriality was expanded and codified. By 1860, large swaths of China's sovereignty had been surrendered to foreign powers. Over the next 50 years, this process continued. Foreign powers carved out spheres of influence in China. Russia took territory in the north. Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, seizing Taiwan and Korea. Germany, France, Britain, and other powers extracted concessions, leases, and exclusive trading rights. China was not formally colonized like India or Africa, but it was subordinated through a system of unequal treaties and foreign-controlled enclaves. This era, from the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, is known in China as the Century of Humiliation. This historical memory profoundly shapes modern Chinese identity and foreign policy. Chinese leaders across the political spectrum, from nationalists to communists, have used the Century of Humiliation as a mobilizing narrative. It explains why China suffered, who was responsible, foreign imperialism, and what must be done to restore China's rightful place in the world. The Communist Party, which took power in 1949, built much of its legitimacy on the promise to end national humiliation and restore Chinese sovereignty and dignity. Mao Zedong explicitly framed the Communist Revolution as the culmination of China's resistance to foreign imperialism. In his famous 1949 speech proclaiming the People's Republic, Mao declared, "The Chinese people have stood up," a direct reference to the century of being forced to bow to foreign powers. The Communist Party portrayed itself as the force that expelled foreign domination, unified China, and restored independence. This narrative resonated because it connected to deeply felt historical grievances. Even today, Chinese children learn about the Opium Wars as foundational national trauma. Textbooks and museums present the wars as unprovoked aggression by Britain and other Western powers seeking to weaken and exploit China. Lin Zexu is celebrated as a national hero who stood up to foreign bullying. The destruction of the old Summer Palace is memorialized as an act of barbarism. The unequal treaties are taught as symbols of China's humiliation and the necessity of strong, centralized power to prevent such humiliation from recurring. This historical consciousness has real policy implications. When Chinese leaders talk about the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, they're invoking the restoration of China's status before the Opium Wars, when China was a central power in Asia and the world. When China asserts territorial claims in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, these claims are framed as recovering what was lost during the century of humiliation. When China reacts with fury to perceived Western condescension or interference, it's responding to historical patterns where Western powers dictated terms to China at gunpoint. China's massive investment in military modernization, particularly its navy, is driven partly by determination never again to be vulnerable to foreign naval power, as it was in the Opium Wars. The People's Liberation Army Navy is now one of the world's largest, and China is building aircraft carriers, advanced submarines, and anti-ship missiles specifically to counter American naval dominance in the Western Pacific. This is not paranoia, it's a strategic response to historical experience. China learned that maritime weakness enabled foreign powers to impose their will. Modern China is ensuring that vulnerability no longer exists. China's insistence on non-interference in internal affairs, a cornerstone of Chinese foreign policy, also stems from the Opium Wars and unequal treaties. Those treaties allowed foreign powers to interfere deeply in China's domestic affairs, from controlling customs revenue to protecting missionaries to dictating legal systems for foreign nationals. China experienced sovereignty violation for a century. Now that China has regained power, its government is hypersensitive to anything resembling foreign interference. This explains Chinese reactions to Western criticism on human rights, democracy, or minority policies. From Beijing's perspective, such criticism echoes the paternalistic imperialism of the 19th century, when Western powers claimed the right to judge and intervene in China's affairs. The Hong Kong handover in 1997 was particularly symbolic. Hong Kong, ceded to Britain in the Treaty of Nanking after the First Opium War, was the most visible legacy of that humiliation. When Britain returned Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, it was celebrated in China as closing a chapter of national humiliation. The Chinese government sees any challenge to its authority in Hong Kong, such as the 2019 pro-democracy protests, as an attempt to reopen that wound. This doesn't justify Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong's freedoms, but it helps explain the emotional and political stakes China attaches to the issue. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure investment program across Asia, Africa, and Europe, can also be understood partly through the lens of Opium War memory. The initiative aims to build trade networks centered on China, reversing the historical pattern where European powers controlled trade routes and dictated commercial terms. By financing ports, railways, and roads across dozens of countries, China is creating infrastructure that facilitates Chinese commerce and extends Chinese influence. Some critics call it debt trap diplomacy, arguing China lends to countries that can't repay and then seizes strategic assets. Whether that's accurate or not, the Belt and Road Initiative reflects Chinese determination to shape global commerce rather than have terms dictated by others, a direct response to the experience of unequal treaties. China's relationship with international institutions also reflects Opium War memory. China is ambivalent about the post-World War II international order, institutions like the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and international law frameworks. On one hand, China participates actively in these institutions and benefits from them. On the other hand, Chinese officials often view them as Western-dominated systems that were created when China was weak and that don't adequately reflect Chinese interests. This is why China is building alternative institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and advocating for reforms that would increase Chinese influence in global governance. China wants to be rule maker, not just rule taker, reversing the dynamic of the unequal treaty era when foreign powers made rules and China had to accept them. The Opium Wars also influence how China views the United States today. Chinese strategists often draw parallels between 19th century Britain and contemporary America. Both were dominant naval powers. Both intervened militarily to protect commercial interests. Both claimed to promote universal values: free trade for Britain, democracy, and human rights for America, while pursuing national interests. Chinese analysts argue that just as Britain used opium and gunboats to subordinate China, America uses financial power and military alliances to contain China's rise. This comparison is polemical and oversimplified, but it reveals how deeply the Opium War experience shapes Chinese perceptions of Western power. This brings us to a critical question for the future. As China becomes more powerful, how will its historical memory of the Opium Wars influence its behavior? Will China seek revenge or simply security? Will it replicate the imperialism it suffered or build different international relationships? These questions don't have clear answers, but they're shaped by the historical legacy we've been discussing. Some Chinese intellectuals and officials argue for learning from history without repeating it. They acknowledge that China suffered from imperialism, but insist that China should not become an imperial power itself. This perspective emphasizes win-win cooperation, mutual respect for sovereignty, and a multipolar world order where no single power dominates. Chinese official rhetoric often stresses these themes, positioning China as a defender of developing countries against Western hegemony. Other voices in China take a more nationalist and revanchist line. They argue that China has the right to assert itself forcefully, that historical humiliation entitles China to recover lost territories and influence, and that Western powers should be treated with the same coercion they once applied to China. This perspective is less common in official statements, but exists in popular nationalism and some academic and military circles. Which vision of China's role will prevail is one of the great geopolitical questions of our time, and that question cannot be understood without understanding the Opium Wars and their century-long aftermath. History is not just past events. It's living memory that shapes present behavior and future possibilities. For people outside China, particularly in the West, the Opium Wars offer uncomfortable lessons about our own histories. Britain's actions in China were not aberrations. They were consistent with a broader pattern of imperial exploitation, where economic interests overrode moral considerations and military power enforced commercial terms. The same Britain that forced opium on China also extracted rubber from Congo through Belgian proxies, exploited indentured labour across its colonies, and caused famines in India through mismanagement and indifference. The Opium Wars fit into a system of global exploitation that enriched Western powers and impoverished much of the world. Recognizing this doesn't mean Westerners today bear personal guilt for what British officials did in 1840. But it does mean honestly confronting how the wealth and power of Western nations was built partly on exploitation, coercion, and systems that destroyed millions of lives. The Industrial Revolution that made Britain powerful was fueled by colonial resources and captive markets. The trade networks that enriched British merchants were protected by naval dominance and imposed treaties. The comfortable middle-class lives of 19th century Britons rested on foundations that included Indian opium profits and Chinese silver. This historical reckoning is difficult because it complicates national myths. Britain likes to remember itself as a force for civilization, as the nation that abolished slavery, as the birthplace of parliamentary democracy and industrial progress. All of that is true, but it coexists with the reality that Britain was also an imperial power that used violence and drugs to extract wealth from vulnerable populations. Both things are true simultaneously, and honest history requires holding both truths together. The same applies to understanding modern global systems. We live in a world economy built on infrastructure and trade networks established during the imperial era. The predominance of English as a global language, the structure of international finance, the location of major ports and trade routes, all of this reflects decisions and power dynamics from the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Opium Wars were one chapter in creating that world. When we benefit from cheap consumer goods manufactured in China, we're participating in economic relationships that have long, complicated histories involving past exploitation and present inequalities. None of this means we should despair or retreat into guilt, but it does mean approaching international relations with humility and awareness. When Western leaders criticize China for human rights violations or aggressive behavior, those criticisms may be justified, but they land differently when they come from nations that once carved up China and forced opium on its people. Moral authority in international affairs is not automatic. It has to be earned through consistent behavior and reckoning with one's own history. Similarly, when China criticizes Western double standards or rejects Western interference, those arguments carry weight because of historical experience. China's points about Western hypocrisy are not excuses for Chinese government abuses, but they are rooted in real historical grievances that can't simply be dismissed. Understanding the Opium Wars helps us navigate these complex moral and political dynamics in contemporary international relations. Let's also consider the parallels to modern drug enforcement and the global war on drugs. The ironies are profound. Western nations, particularly the United States, have spent the past 50 years waging wars on drug trafficking. Billions of dollars have been spent on interdiction, eradication, and incarceration. Military forces have been deployed to combat drug cartels in Latin America and Asia. Harsh penalties have been imposed on traffickers and users. This effort has been justified as protecting public health, fighting organized crime, and upholding the rule of law. Yet the historical record shows that Western powers were themselves the world's largest drug traffickers when it served their interests. Britain forced opium on China for a century. During the Vietnam War, some American military and intelligence operations were entangled with heroin trafficking through Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle. The CIA's involvement with cocaine trafficking during the Contra Wars has been extensively documented. When drug enforcement conflicted with geopolitical goals, enforcement gave way. This doesn't mean current anti-drug efforts are insincere, but it does reveal how drug policy is shaped by power and interests, not just moral principles. When drugs serve powerful interests, they're protected and their harms minimized. When drugs threaten those interests, or when marginalized populations use them, they're criminalized and their users imprisoned. The war on drugs in the United States has disproportionately targeted poor communities and people of color, resulting in mass incarceration that has devastated families and neighborhoods. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies marketed addictive opioids to middle-class patients with minimal legal consequences until public pressure forced accountability. The Opium Wars remind us that drug policy is always political. It's about who has power to define what substances are acceptable, who profits from drug trade, legal or illegal, and who bears the costs of addiction and enforcement. Britain could force opium on China because Britain had naval supremacy and China did not. The United States can prosecute its war on drugs in Latin America because it has military and economic leverage over those regions. Power shapes whose drug use is medicalized and whose is criminalized, whose drug trafficking is called commerce and whose is called crime. So what are the broader lessons from the Opium Wars for understanding power, morality, and international relations?